So we know that the t-table adjusts for sample size by giving us degrees of freedom to go ahead and find our probabilities or our percentages. The question is, like, what is it actually doing physically? And to understand that, let's talk about what happens if we have low degrees of freedom. With low degrees of freedom, the t-table is really, really chunky on its end tails. That is, there's a lot of air. It's pretty flat. This can be seen if you go ahead and look at degrees of freedom 1 here. For instance, if I go ahead and trace my 95% confidence up, let's look at what happens to the t-scores in there. In the beginning, with degrees of freedom 1, I have a t-score of 12.71. And what this is telling me is that in order to get the middle 95%, I need to go out to a t-score of 12.71. That is, I have to go way the heck out on the outside there. Really, really far out to get that middle 95%. Now, if I go ahead and I make my degrees of freedom a little bit larger. So for instance, let's look at a degrees of freedom being 6, so this row right here. If I have degrees of freedom 6, then my t-table gets a little higher in the center, and my end tails get a little bit lower as a result. So maybe something like this. And what this tells me here is, once again, if I want the middle 95%, I no longer have to go 12 standard deviations out. Now I only have to go 2.47 out. Sorry, 2.447 out. So now I don't have to go nearly as far out to get that middle 95%. So that is t equals 2.447 there. Now if I make my degrees of freedom a little bit larger still, let's go down to degrees of freedom 21 here. What I want you to notice is, once again, my end tails have gotten smaller, and I can tell that because I don't have to go as far out. Up here I had to go out 12, then 2.447 standard deviations. Here I only have to go out 2.080. So that is, once again, these end tails are getting smaller, and the hump in the middle of my curve is getting bigger. So my data is accumulating in the center more. If I trace this all the way down here, I'm moving further and further and further down, notice those t-scores are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. This means the higher my degrees of freedom, I don't have to go out as far anymore. My data is accumulating in the center more. In fact, if I go all the way down to the bottom here, notice I have to go out 1.96 standard deviations to get the middle 95%, and that is exactly my z-score. That is, for a proportions confidence interval, I use a z-score of 1.96 for 95% confidence. What's happening here with the t-distribution is I go from having really fat end tails to smaller end tails to smaller end tails, until finally, for a very, very large sample size, my t-table is exactly the same as a normal distribution.